Hi, I'm Leavy. I'm the Senior Manager for Innovation and Learning at the Harwood Institute.
Hi, my name is Aasil Ahmad. I'm a co-founder at VOTIFI.com. Please join the conversation. When we built VOTIFI, we built it as a platform that allowed people to sort of figure out their political DNA, so to speak, across a whole bunch of issues. And it turns out that irrespective of, let's say, political affiliation or party affiliation, most people are pretty nuanced. And they have many degrees of rightness and leftness on many different issues. And that it's quite, in this environment where people have so much access to information and opportunities to share what they know, it's quite reductionist to sort of limit people based on their party. And I think the sort of media environment likes to pigeonhole people and say that, you know, you're right or you're left or you're this or you're that, and therefore this should be your position on issues. And in reality, I think a lot of people reject that, and we built VOTIFI to help people figure out where they lie on the map, and then connect them with other people who, irrespective of their voting patterns, may have a great deal of interest in issues that and overlapping views with people from other sides of the political divide, and that if we can connect those people in a way that they recognize those interests and can talk about those issues together, that you might start bridging some of these divides and creating more conversations in sort of the political space that can overcome a lot of the polarization that's happening sort of at the top level.
It's interesting, the idea that that engagement isn't simply identification, right? That there is a process of being in relation. I wonder how the platform enables people to stay in relation, not just simply to know something about themselves, but to move beyond that and to get towards a conversation with others.
I mean, I think you see technology enabling a lot of types of transactions now, reducing the uncertainty in transactions, whether you go to Amazon and get recommendations for what to read or what to watch, or Netflix movies to watch. What we do is we try to recommend the content and the conversations that are most likely to facilitate that engagement. So if we learn from a user what their preferences are, that they care a lot about budget issues or healthcare issues and not a whole lot about foreign policy issues, and we want to group them with people who have similar views. And in some cases we want them to be in their comfort zone, where they're talking to people and they can basically sort of agree to agree. And in some cases we also want to challenge people and say that, you know, you're leaning a little too much one way on this, and that's not good. It's better that you have access to more information and more conversations. And then there's a whole sort of element of incentivizing sort of the kinds of behaviors that are conducive to community building. And so that means the same way, you know, you might check into a bunch of places on Foursquare and get rewarded with the mayorship. We think that there should be a way for people to participate in debates and discussions and work your way up the ranks from, you know, mayor to governor to senator, or whatever it might be, and that entails then certain additional rights and responsibilities. And so people want their opinions to be heard. People love to share their opinions. I mean, if you think about just the behavior of answering poll questions online, I mean, it's apparently one of the most common and popular behaviors online. So we think there's something there in terms of getting people to engage with content and then rewarding that behavior with, you know, the opportunity to do sort of live debates with other people, or the opportunities to put your name on a bill that gets submitted to Congress, you know, because you've crowdsourced from 15,000 people the elements of that bill. And so those are some of the ways that we think you can use the technology but still have it very much rooted in online and offline behaviors.
So in a lot of our work, which is focused primarily on face-to-face interaction, but with communities and the partners we work with, you know, there's that same notion of building the conditions that enable a certain kind of interaction, right? So whereas you could have a town hall meeting where everybody lines up and you get 30 seconds to sort of spout off your opinion before somebody taps you on the shoulder and tells you your time's up now to the next person, you know, we're trying to work with our partners, groups like United Way, American Library Association, to think about community engagement in a different way. So actual conversations where you can get to those nuances, where you're able to find out that there's more that you have in common than you certainly could with a 30-second sort of soundbite. And again, those conditions are critical, right? Without building those conditions, the sort of prevailing forces are those that sort of pull us apart, or would say, you know, this label, this identity that you either have chosen for yourself or have been given will overwhelm any sort of common ground. And I'm wondering if that's something that you see playing out on VOTIFI as well.
I mean, we find people to be appreciative of feeling like they're part of a community without a whole lot of investment in time, right? So people's attention is super scattered across a lot of different things. And so our goal was to build something which was kind of not super intrusive in their daily routine. So every morning we send people a poll question, and they can get it by text message, they can get it by email, or they can get it as a notification on a smartphone. And so that's sort of a question that's ripped from the headlines. Some people need to go look up the story to kind of learn about it and then vote. And some people know about it, and some people, but they sort of wait for that sort of little hook into the day, and that connects them with some other people. And then immediately following the response, we give them like feedback, how the community voted, and who in your network may have voted like you, things like that, just so that there's an exchange going on. And I think when it comes to civic engagement, there's frequently a lot of receiving information from the community, and to get that community perhaps even more engaged, there's got to be sort of a feedback mechanism where they see where things are headed, and they're part of that process. And I think that's where a lot of the technology, when it comes to civic engagement, has moved in the direction over the last couple of years, in terms of not just inviting people and then getting information, and then maybe 3 or 4 months later they might see some outcome of that conversation. So I don't know if that's one of the things that you've noticed helps people to feel more bought into the process.
Yeah, it's really critical. There's so many engagement processes that are essentially at best transactional, right? So everybody shows up, they give some meaningful piece of themselves by sharing information, and it goes off into this void. And if you're lucky, 3 months from now you get something, but often it's this kind of, you showed up and we maybe gave you some donuts and cookies, and you told this meaningful story about your kids, and it might show up in our brochure, and we may never do anything. And so with the groups we work with, we're really clear about the need. If you're gonna ask people to come and to engage and to share meaningful things, you need to take the responsibility for being stewards of that public voice, right? And that means setting clear expectations, how the information is going to be used, not over-promising. So this conversation isn't going to lead to transformational change across the country, but it is going to lead to us shaping how we have our staff meetings and think about our work, and we're going to promise to get back to you with what we heard. And in so much of the way that people engage, particularly in the nonprofit and governmental communities, it's let's bring everybody together, we're going to ask some questions, and then we never follow up. And so being seen, being heard, feeling as though you had some contribution to the process is really critical. And and I can imagine that that's one of the really appealing things, in your process. I'm wondering, as you think about VOTIFI, which I know is really still a young thing in the grand scheme of it, are there places where those conversations or those interactions have given people a chance to go deeper or to create change that you guys can see, or is it still too young?
Well, when we in the process of building a startup, you go through all these sort of phases of picking a name of the company, picking a slogan, what's the hook, and you're constantly responding to signals you're getting from users and from investors. And so Lou, who's the founder, came up with this slogan, I think during an interview, where it was, when the people connect, the politicians will listen. And so it was a fundamentally different model that we took, which is that we're not trying to solve the problem of governance per se, that it's hard for people to communicate with Congress people or with their elected officials. That's a problem. I mean, it's a problem because average congressional office gets how many millions of emails and whatever a day. But our view was that if there are pockets of people who are engaged around a certain issue and they're really active, and not just during campaign years, but throughout, because there's campaigns going on all the time, depending on the issues that you care about, that if we can enable that in some way, that there would be some civic value, towards what we're trying to do in terms of just building a business. And we believe that adding an activism component to VOTIFI was important. It was being done, and there are other people who are working on that stuff, and so we pulled back in terms of just the investment in the technology, not to sort of spread ourselves too thin. But many people have asked us, in fact many users have asked us, I've answered all these questions, now what do I do? What's the next step? And so obviously there's a demand there, and it's like we have a whiteboard in the office that has all these things that we'd love to do, at some point. So I think it's important, and whether we are able to do that. I mean, we've partnered with, some of the projects we've done with some of our clients have essentially been around identifying those clusters of interest in their audience and then figuring out ways to enable it. So ultimately it's the organization that's got to do the work to pull people together.
In the work we're doing in communities, we find that same thing, that there's a narrative in the country that says the American public is disengaged, or they're so polarized that
nothing can get done.
And you can find measures that support that. And at the same time, you can go into church basements and into firehouses and into to coffee shops, and you can see people coming together and having conversations. And that doesn't get this. It's not a particularly interesting narrative in the grand scheme of things. You can also find that when you pull people together and enable them to have a meaningful conversation and enable them to talk about issues in the way that they're framing them, that one of the outcomes, as you're saying, is one, they feel energized, and I can imagine that shows up in all kinds of metrics for you guys. They feel a rekindled sense of possibility, and at the end, they feel this sense of like, well, we should start doing something now that I have this confidence. Now I have this restored belief that I'm not the only one who cares about this. They want to get moving, and it's that energy that is so often missing from the way that electoral engagement seems to be, which is, the only thing we really need you to do is either to give us money, maybe you can put up a yard sign, and then make sure you go vote. And there's so much between those 4 years or 2 years where people are saying, well, that's great, but my kids are going to schools where the paint is falling off, and that's not okay. And they come out of conversations with our partners, and they say, okay, so let's just go. We're not waiting for a nonprofit. Let's just go buy some darn paint, and let's take action. And so to have an organization like yours that's giving people that, either organizations the ability to sort of source who's interested, but also the individuals, seems really, really powerful. I'm curious where the sort of the impetus for your guys' approach to engagement came from. What started that?
Well, it's probably slightly unrelated in the sense that again, Lou, the founder, had an aha moment standing at the bus, dropping his kids off at school at the bus stop in his neighborhood, and it was during the sort of later part of the 2008 election cycle, and everybody was getting just bombarded with robocalls at home, and they were all complaining. All the parents were complaining about it, and there was one younger parent at the bus stop who said, "I don't have that problem," and they asked him, why not? And he held up his iPhone or whatever and said, "This is all I have," and so he didn't get calls on his smartphone. And so Lou's aha moment was sort of, wow, there's a whole demographic now of people who are unreachable through the sort of traditional mechanism of opinion gathering in the country. And what that means is that there's a whole group of people who are unrepresented and potentially marginalized in the process. And turns out that as more and more Americans shift away from this sort of obvious thing of having a home phone, they are sort of out of the traditional process of understanding what the electorate thinks. And the polling industry is one that's, I think, relatively slow to innovate in terms of adapting to the technology and the behaviors that are now quite common. So we thought maybe there's a way to build greater civic ties, but also build a business around polling using technology as a mechanism for opinion gathering and building sort of a richer data set of what people think without calling them at dinner time and sort of harassing them for 30 minutes. So as we thought through the idea of this, the whole idea of VOTIFI really sort of took off as a platform for political engagement as opposed to a replacement for or a solution to the problem in the polling industry. And we started to see a lot of interest among people who, every 2 years or every 4 years get really frustrated with the nature of the political process. And I think going back to what you were talking about, in terms of the political process, I think that there's a lot of unique things that happen in the United States when it comes to how issues are presented and how people advocate for causes. And there's this sort of pervasive influence of impact of money, and now with super PACs, and we can only imagine the influence of super PAC money in the next cycle. And so I think that to counterbalance that, one strategy is spend more money, right? But I think, and what we've learned from within our team and our interns, and we have a very diverse team sort of running the business, and also from the users, is that the relative value of the nth ad, whether it's an internet ad or a TV ad, is significantly lower than the value of the recommendation coming from a friend. I don't think the solution to the influence of money is more money. I think probably one of the solutions is to just build greater cohesiveness in communities, not necessarily nationwide, but in specific communities, so that people, and I think that's one of the great things about what your institute does in terms of sort of building some of those foundational elements, and then, what people do after that is sort of up to them, right?
You can find almost as many examples in local communities of things that are broken and fit that great narrative of we can't get things done. And you can look within that same community, and there will almost always be pockets of change. So we focus on those as one of the key
So how do you
engines.
find those?
So part of it's looking for them. I mean, just to be honest, part of it is a willingness to recognize that even in the most hard-hit communities, so even in places, we do work in places like Detroit and in Flint, we've worked in Newark, working in Youngstown right now. So you look in those places, and the national narrative, or even sometimes the regional narrative, is jobs are leaving, everybody's, we're never going to get back to the good old days, whatever it is, right? But there's a pervasive negative narrative. And then you go into a place like Youngstown and you look at, say, the director of the libraries there, a guy named Carlton Sears, who's done work with us, who has transformed the way the library works. The library has gone from simply being a repository of books to being a significant both cultural and political institution there. And you look at people making decisions for fundamentally different reasons, right? So there's a great little anecdote about Carlton, who recognized so that there's a huge divide in Youngstown between the county and the city. It happens everywhere, or seemingly everywhere. And so the county has more money and is afraid of coming into the city in parts. So there's this boulevard, Midlothian, and there's a whole thing about you don't cross that, right? So you stay on your nice safe side and you don't go into the city. It's a boulevard in the middle of Youngstown. It really doesn't need to be that big a deal. So he builds this library with intentionally like the most state-of-the-art meeting rooms to appeal to the folks who live on the other side, and he puts it up against Midlothian. So you can have access to these great meeting rooms, but you're going to have to cross it. And what happens is, so in communities like Youngstown, that creates a pocket. So the sort of the neighborhood watch on one side of Midlothian, on the other, now talk to each other, right? Because the criminals don't care which side they're on. If they're going to rob you, they're going to rob you. But now the neighborhood watch talks, right? Because there's this institution that says this border is silly, that we've got to find a way to work together. And yes, there are different political jurisdictions, but the lives of people are affected equally on both sides. So those little pockets, it's telling that story, even while recognizing that there are still real challenges in Youngstown. So it's not papering over the challenges, but it's saying there's another story. There's a contest over the narrative, and we can keep saying the same old story, and we'll keep getting pretty similar results, or we can start to identify places where it's being done differently, and giving those their due, not overselling them, not hyping them, not pretending like Carlton's library is the way forward, and if we only did that everywhere, things would be perfect. But recognizing that it does have a contribution, and I have to imagine that both with your work at VOTIFI, but also your vast experience elsewhere, there have to be little pockets where even in the midst of really difficult narratives, really difficult situations, there's enough to hold on to that stuff starts moving differently, and you can start to build off of that. I'm curious if those have come forward.
Well, a lot of your insights come through these one-to-one interactions, and so it's actually it's a challenging process to scale that city to city, county to county, state to state, but that coupled with an analytics strategy, an analytics tool that helps to understand some of the things that are going on at the grassroots level within communities, will, I think, enable some of this stuff to be scaled up significantly. And that's not to say that technology is sort of the solution, but the fact that everybody is carrying around a smartphone, that they're sharing a lot of information in social networks, and they may share information about the things that they like and they don't like about a community, and the fact that that raw unstructured data can now sort of be understood in more and more sophisticated ways will make some of this stuff easier and easier to do. I think there will still always be an online and an offline component. I don't think that you can program human interactions into a computer, but I think what you can do is you can cut through a lot of the obscurity as to where you might be able to find the most valuable interventions and go after those. And so, I mean, it's interesting. I live in Chicago right now because my wife is in graduate school there, and the city of Chicago is investing heavily in networks. So they're creating free Wi-Fi zones all over the city, including in south side of Chicago, which, as many people know, is a pretty rough part of the city and has been in the news a lot as far as violence and underdevelopment. And I asked the director of social media for the city, how are you going to, I mean, okay, it's great, you just make Wi-Fi available, but then what? And there's a concerted effort to develop applications that make the city's services and the sort of interaction between citizens in that part of the city more fluid and actually benefit from the technology. And so I think in the process of doing that, there's more and more information about how people are interacting and how the services of the city and the municipality are being used, and then that creates even greater visibility as to where you might be able to find these pockets of either dysfunction or function. What's also interesting about Chicago is you have this mass exodus of people from the Obama for America campaign all just roaming around looking for something to do.
Right.
And many of them are actually very bright, and they've looked at the problem of community engagement in pretty significant and deep ways within the campaign, and so they're bringing some of that know-how, I think, into other sectors. And I think even in the corporate sector, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about analytics really driving return on investment, and so I think the city of Chicago just put out an announcement to look for a new sort of senior accountant, like sort of the person managing some of this stuff for the city, who's got a background in analytics, because they want to basically optimize using the data that they're getting from some of that function. And so I think this is bleeding edge stuff, and I think there will be a gradual sort of integration of analytics into the sort of mundane functions of picking up trash or plowing streets. I mean, Chicago did a great thing where they put GPS devices on all their snowplows, and so when because you had this huge snowstorm 3 years ago that really paralyzed the city, and people were wondering, when is the plow coming to my street? So they put a GPS on all the trucks, and then they put a map that was a real time where the trucks are and what streets are they plowing, so that you had some idea that the work was actually getting done.
It's interesting. There's this, I think, a great marriage that is too often or too rarely consummated, if we can use that example, between expert knowledge or data and what I would think of as public knowledge, right? So there are all kinds of technical and important things that require an expertise and a sort of a data, right? So so trash collection is look, you gotta get it done, right? And there's somebody at the city of Chicago who's really smart about figuring out what routes make sense and in what order and all that kind of stuff, right? And so asking the public to sort of comment on, like, well, in what order do you think we should plow the Miracle Mile? Like, we could ask them, but why? That's not their job to know that, right? But there are all these other hosts of issues that get turned into technical problems, but are fundamentally much more gut level.
Right.
And it's that marriage where you have, so if I think about some of the work that we've done in Battle Creek, right? So this group of people in Battle Creek, came together from 6 different organizations, and they wanted to work on issues around vulnerable children, right? And they said, look, let's figure out what's, where we need to fit, and then we'll go from there, right? And it turns out Battle Creek is home to the Kellogg Foundation and has really strong resources and lots of nonprofits. And so rather than creating yet another sort of fix, they said, well, we need to find a way to connect people, right? So, and again, they took a different path. They could have gone with, let's get all of the data we have, put it, sort of torture the data until it confesses, and we'll figure out what program we're going to run, and then we'll go and we'll get funding, and they found out that actually one of the challenges facing Battle Creek was there was a large Burmese population that had immigrated and that was nowhere on the map. They were as marginalized as could be within that community. Now, it's not like Battle Creek's huge, but
that
they
was
were
causing a lot of the...
No, what it was, they weren't contributing. They were just being ignored. So you had women in hospitals in Battle Creek delivering babies on the phone because they couldn't get translation services. So they were calling Burmese translators in Chicago, getting instructions to the doctor, relayed to this mother. And that's something that wasn't on anybody's radar screen, and it wasn't going to get surfaced through a survey or online.
Right.
So how do you take that, which is sort of the public knowledge that comes only from conversation, right? And then they began to work with the community college, which can say, oh, well, we have a technical expertise in training translators. And that marriage, neither side could do it alone, right? Just knowing that isn't enough. And just, and just having the technical fix isn't enough.
I think that the successful groups, cities, municipalities, organizations are going to be there's no replacement for the real world experience.
Exactly.
The gut, the fact that you've been doing this. I think that the unsuccessful ones will be the ones that say, well, we need the data research team here, and then the sort of practitioners here, and then they should just submit a memo or something.
Right.
So I think that's where sort of this integrated approach, holistic approach, will make a difference. So what do you think is kind of on the horizon?
There is a growing sense of public frustration with this notion that we sort of live in a Tower of Babel where we can't talk to each other, where everything is about sort of who can be the loudest and sometimes even the crassest and the most divisive, and that sort of if we win, then it's okay that we did that, and if we lose, it's because we didn't do enough of it. And so I think there's a sense amongst enough organizations that their relevance, their significance, their impact on the community is going to come from the degree to which they're able to engage, the degree to which they're able to make decisions that are rooted in something real, in people's aspirations for the community, not just a way to get the next dollar of donation or the next dollar of grant funding. That reassures me. Now, it comes out of a tough place, but I think that there are enough organizations, we've seen groups like United Way, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the American Library Association, and countless others step forward and say, okay, we need to work in a different way. And you start to think about, United Way has 1,300 local chapters, ALA is in every library in the country, Corporation for Public Broadcasting runs all that, so you start to imagine those groups bumping into each other and having conversations like this, or conversations about, well, we have this piece of knowledge, and we work in this kind of way, and you work in this kind of way, and why is it that we couldn't find a way to sort of, again, not, it's not going to happen all at once, and it's not going to be this great revolution that, that sort of sweeps everywhere, but how do we make certain places beacon communities that symbolize that we can do things differently and restore that belief? And
in 2008, there was no iPad, right? And now iPads are like sort of the device du jour that people think about when they're thinking about what can we do to be cutting edge. 2016, who knows what we'll be using, right? And we'll probably have chips embedded in us at that point. So our view is that the technology is really making a lot of things at a personal level really possible and becoming more and more commonplace. And so we're just sort of really excited to sort of see as there's 42 million Xboxes in American households, used primarily not for gaming.
Really?
Right. And so it's just like these are opportunities for connecting people that people with professionals, patients with doctors, neighbors with neighbors in other cities. And so I think that we're pretty excited about the space that we're in. Technology, civic engagement, to some extent politics. We really have no idea where things will end up in a couple of years, but we're trying our best to sort of stay on that bleeding edge and figure out what it is that's going to make people more excited and more engaged and more involved and want to be part of the solution as opposed to sort of passive sort of observers. So. Yeah.